Hello, and welcome. I am Glenn Tiffert, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and manager of its project on China's global sharp power, which is hosting this event in conjunction with our co-sponsor on the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. On October 6, 1976, Mao's widow and her closest associates, known to us as the Gang of Four, were arrested in a mostly bloodless operation that eliminated them from the succession struggle that followed Mao's death. They were expelled from the party, put on public trial, and imprisoned for decades. Their arrest was followed by the Beijing Spring, an extraordinary moment of political and intellectual ferment that one of our guests, Roger Garside, witnessed and documented in his first book, Coming Alive, China After Mao. Sadly, Deng Xiaoping used the Beijing Spring to discredit his rivals in his bid for power, and when it had served that purpose, he crushed it. Deng launched the economic reforms that transformed China into the colossus that we recognize today. But the limits of his vision became abundantly clear in June 1989, when the aspirations of millions of Chinese for corresponding political reforms were ruthlessly crushed once more. China has racked up astounding achievements in the decades since, but today's Chinese youth speak of involution, neijuan, being trapped in an endlessly intensifying cycle of struggle and work without ever getting ahead. In recent years, Xi Jinping has pursued a kind of political involution, doubling down on discipline and repression for fear that the Chinese Communist Party was hurtling towards the fate of its Soviet cousin. In many ways, his methods are backfiring. They are alienating critical partners, raising international tension and the risk of military confrontation, and threatening to squelch the dynamism of the Chinese people who have catapulted their country to the heights that it now enjoys today. To many observers, Xi's position looks secure. But is it? Our speakers today, Roger Garside and Tong Biao, provoke us to think outside the box, to look beyond Xi Jinping and to imagine a China that repudiates his vision and instead chooses democracy, a path long denied to it, if only to save itself from the potentially calamitous dead end that Xi is leading them into. How could that happen? What role can outsiders play to nurture or facilitate it? After their presentations, Elizabeth Economy will then join them in conversation. I'd like to remind you that our session today will close with a brief question and answer period. You can submit your your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to my co-host, Orville Schell, who will introduce our guests.
Thank you, Glenn. It's a great pleasure to co-host this with Hoover, Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations. Roger Garside, our first presenter, is a person whose distinguishing feature for me is that he brings over a half a century of lived history with China to bear on his new and very interesting and provocative book, China Coup. He began in Hong Kong in the late 50s, attached to a Gurkha regiment. He studied in Hong Kong beginning in 1965, just before the Cultural Revolution erupted, and then went to Beijing as part of the Foreign Service, the Embassy of the UK, to spend several years just during the Cultural Revolution sort of high tide. Then he became a fellow at MIT, did a stint at the World Bank, but then went back to the embassy in Beijing again in the late 70s at another very seminal moment after Zhou Enlai died and Tiananmen Square filled with people. And then the Democracy Wall movement erupted in 78, 79, about which he wrote a wonderful book called Coming Alive. And so I think for him to look back over this great sweep of history and try to make sense out of it is his really distinguishing feature. And we're thrilled to have him with us today. As he says, a rapidly changing society with a static political system. That's what characterizes China. And he says, I believe that China's search for a modern identity is entering a new and perilous phase. So Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Orville, for your introduction, and thank you, Hoover and the Asia Society, for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm honored to be in such company. And greetings to all of you who have logged into this event. So what role can outsiders play in helping China towards democracy? First, let me say what they cannot do. They cannot dictate how China is governed, but they can and must help those Chinese who want democratic China to achieve it. People like Deng Biao. In this, our opponent is not the Chinese people, but the regime which rules them. The prospect of China becoming the biggest economy in the world under a totalitarian regime equipped with advanced technologies of control is a nightmare, and a nightmare which we must prevent from becoming reality. The regime which rules China today is totalitarian, not authoritarian. Deng Biao will have more to say on that. The prevailing view is that this regime is strong and stable and will rule China for the foreseeable future. But I contend that this regime is outwardly strong and inwardly weak. This supposedly all-powerful regime is actually powerless to resolve a whole array of deep-seated problems that have plagued China for years, indeed decades. Why? Because these problems are actually the product of the totalitarian system. I examine them in detail in my book, but let me sketch out a few now. First, the economy, which has recorded spectacular growth, is now itself beset by serious problems. The transition to the market economy, which liberated the energy of the Chinese people, was stopped in its tracks in 2008 by the Communist Party. The commanding heights of the economy, including banking, utilities, and transport, were kept in the state sector. Why? Not for economic reasons, but for political ones. The party feared that to allow private companies to occupy all the commanding heights in the economy would destroy its political monopoly. The transition to the market economy will not be resumed unless and until the political system is changed. To compensate for the inefficiency which has resulted from stopping the transition, the state has been pumping vast amounts of credit into the economy to maintain an artificially high growth rate, because it fears the unemployment and corporate defaults which would result from lower growth. The result is a debt mountain. No nation with a debt mountain as high as China's has ever reduced it without either recession or prolonged inflation. Second great problem, the catastrophic state of its environment, vividly illustrated by Liz Economy in her book, The River Runs Black. The regime has given economic growth priority over pollution control because, as I've just pointed out, it fears the political consequences of lower growth. It has also suppressed the non-governmental organizations which have a vital role to play in monitoring pollution and holding government and industry to account. This totalitarian regime does not permit the growth of vigorous, autonomous NGOs in any field. A third problem is China's moral crisis, which is officially recognized. At its heart is corruption. This corruption is the result of a deliberate strategy adopted to sustain the regime. When the Tiananmen massacre of 1989 destroyed the moral authority of the Communist Party, its leaders rebuilt the loyalty of officials by offering them an unprecedented opportunity for corruption. The greatest privatization of state-owned assets which the world has ever seen was conducted without requiring legal clarity of the identity of the new owners, party officials and their friends in business. Exercise effective control without legal accountability. To eliminate this systemic cause of corruption would require the rule of law, an independent judiciary, a free press, and political pluralism. In short, a democratic revolution. Fourth problem. This supposedly mighty regime is fearful. It fears truth. The party has always hidden the truth about events of immense importance in the history of its 70-year rule. It fears democracy. It has suppressed freedom in Hong Kong because of its fear that the attachment to democracy and the rule of law of just 7.5 million Hong Kongers would infect the 1.4 billion inhabitants of the mainland whom it keeps in a condition of political slavery. It fears, it fears religion. It's alarmed by the explosive growth of all major religions in China since 1979. Alarmed that so many men and women should regard God rather than the party as the supreme authority in the universe. So it's persecuting religion to a degree not seen since the death of Mao. Its strategy of cultural genocide in Xinjiang and Tibet are the most extreme manifestations of this. All these factors have combined to create a lack of trust between the people and the regime which rules them. Since 2011, the budget for internal security has exceeded that for the military. The regime fears internal dissent more than it fears its foreign enemies. But the lack of trust is not only an internal problem, it also poisons China's international relations. Abroad, as at home, distrust has been dramatically intensified by the cover-up of the origins of COVID-19. This is part of a wider alienation of the US and its allies. Countries which once engaged with China in benign partnership have now become hostile. Trust will not be restored until there is a change of political regime in China. I repeat, this regime is outwardly strong, but inwardly weak. There's much evidence that the damage which the political system is doing to China is recognized by many in its ruling elite. I examine the evidence for this in my book. Here, I will cite one example. In 2012-2013, the Chinese government and the World Bank published a joint report entitled China 2030. It was the product of the biggest collaboration between the Chinese government and the World Bank ever. It proposed far-reaching reforms of the economy and society. There was, of course, no mention of political reform. But it was quite clear that none of these reforms could be fully implemented without political reform. That must have been clear to the Chinese who contributed to the study. Who led the input of the Chinese government? Today's Premier, Li Keqiang. I do not suggest that any leaders of the Communist Party have undergone a Damascene conversion to the ideals of liberal democracy. But I am convinced that some have reached a pragmatic recognition of the need for a change of political system. They can also see that, paradoxically, their best hope of defending their own personal wealth and power is to lead the nation into systemic change. When dictators are overthrown, it's usually by rivals within the elite. This will be the fate of Xi Jinping. And those who overthrow him will not be satisfied by a change of leader. They'll want a transition to democracy. So how can outsiders help those Chinese who want political change to achieve it? Moral outrage and soft power will not be sufficient. Military intervention is unthinkable. The US and its allies enjoy economic superiority over China, and they must use it. China depends upon access to the world's major reserve currencies, the international banking system, the world's deepest capital markets, its biggest pools of mobile capital, and the greatest centers of scientific and technological discovery, all of which are controlled by the US and its allies. This gives us the power to create the conditions for change. We must exploit this power in a graduated way that incentivizes change and imposes a price on the present course, because China is deeply interwoven with us, economically and socially. The elaboration and implementation of this strategy is a far more complex problem than that for confronting the Soviet Union. It requires a great effort of collaboration between different agencies within governments, between governments and strategists outside governments, and between governments. Decoupling across the board is neither realistic nor desirable, but we must accept short-run economic costs in order to defend and promote our long-term political and economic interests. Our governments must educate public opinion, including vested interests like Wall Street and the City of London, that ultimately our economic welfare depends upon global politics. To carry public opinion with them, our governments must be clear about the nature of the threat and open about the objective of a free China. The means for achieving that objective may sometimes need to be protected by secrecy. But there is nothing to be lost and much to be gained by openly declaring our objective. The regime in Beijing already denounces hostile foreign forces for seeking political change in China. So we've nothing to lose by openness. Indeed, we have much to gain, because those Chinese who secretly want change will be heartened by our commitment. The US has made a good start by legislation that will deny access to the US capital markets to companies that fail to disclose to investors financial information required by law, as all Chinese companies listed and traded on our markets fail to do. And by denying access to US technology for many companies that are linked to the military. Last week, the European Parliament voted overwhelmingly to suspend ratification of its comprehensive agreement on investment with China. I predict that that agreement will not be revived until there is political change in China. At last, the US and its allies have awakened from their sleepwalk on China. The hour is late, but not too late. We need to work with great urgency so that people like Deng Biao can soon return to Beijing to resume their great work of building a free China.
Well, our thanks to Roger Garside for getting our conversation going. And now we turn to Tong Dao, who is Chinese, who's actually lived much of the sweep of history that Roger describes and is now in exile in this country. He's the former lecturer at the University of Politics and Law in China. But above all, he is a human rights lawyer, a person who believes that law should be put into practice. And it was through the defense of a number of clients that got him arrested and into trouble in 2011. And since then, since coming to the United States, he's been at Harvard Law School, at Yale Law School, Hunter College, and now teaches at the University of Chicago at the Pozen Center on Human Rights. He is always, in my experience, a principled and reasonable voice. And Biao, we're very curious to get your reaction to the remarks of Roger Garside. How practical is his analysis? How do you view it as a Chinese who has lived inside this system that he describes? So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you, Roger, for your wonderful book and your wonderful presentation. Thank you, Glenn, Larry, Liz, and everyone joining this conversation. After the Chinese Communist Party established the totalitarian state in 1949, some Chinese people have made great effort to fight for freedom and democracy. Here are some pictures of the democracy movement. In 1957, the May 19th movement, the April 5th movement, and Xinjiang Democracy Wall, and everyone knows the Tiananmen Democracy Movement in 1989, and Charter 08 that Dr. Liu Xiaobo and many other Chinese intellectuals initiated. When I was in China, I promoted the rights defense movement since 2003. Since we use the existing legal channels to defend citizens' rights and freedom, we took human rights cases, funded NGOs, developed online campaigns, participated in local elections, and organized a protest against the forced eviction and miscarriage of justice. The main political social factors behind the rights defense movement include the development of legal professions. In September 1976, Chairman Mao Zedong did the only correct thing in his whole life. He finally died. Then legal system could be recovered. And also the space for traditional media and internet, development of market economy. And there had been a intellectual liberalization movement between 1980s and 2013. More and more Chinese people were supportive of liberal democracy and rule of law, not the party propaganda. The rights defense movement can be seen as a practice of Chinese liberalism. The development of this movement experienced four trends since its rising, namely organization, politicization, street activism, and internationalization. And because of the Chinese government never stopped its crackdown. Here are some pictures of the human rights movement since 2003. the Xiamen protest, house churches, the Fujian protest against the arrest of 3 bloggers, and Wukan village protest, and Southern Weekly, and joint citizen meals, part of the New Citizens movement. And people were delivering a speech to demand the disclosure of official assets. So Chinese government never stopped its crackdown, but because of my human rights work, I was banned from teaching and eventually fired by my university. I was disbarred. I was banned from traveling internationally, and I was even kidnapped by Chinese secret police for 3 times and tortured. But since Xi Jinping came to power, the persecution became much more brutal. The CCP targets not only lawyers or dissidents, but also NGOs, internet, like universities, house churches, and of course Tibetans and the Xinjiang ethnic minorities. Everything in favor of promoting civil society in Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao era had been suppressed by Xi Jinping. Why? The Communist Party is beset by economic strife, conflicts between the people and the officials, widespread corruption, environmental disasters, unrest in Xinjiang and Tibet, and its own sense of ideological crisis. So the party no longer has the ability to carry out the frantic Mao-style mass mobilization, and the public's frustration with the party is growing. On the other hand, the human rights movement had gained more and more support and influence in Jiang and Hu era. The party regarded the pro-democracy movement as an urgent threat to the one-party rule. In this context, I made an argument that many may disagree. Xi abolished the presidential term limit, established the cultural personality, turning China from a collective dictatorship to a more personal dictatorship. But it is not that Xi Jinping has subverted the old system of the Communist Party, but that the party needs Xi Jinping to reverse its fate of being subverted. In the calculation of CCP, a personal dictatorship is more necessary and effective to respond to the comprehensive crisis than a collective dictatorship. So I'm skeptical that Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, or Wang Qishan is willing to plan a coup to overturn Xi Jinping. The majority of Chinese scholars and that Western Chinese scholars tend to use authoritarianism to conceptualize and categorize the post-Mao Chinese political system. But in my analysis, the current system is not authoritarian, but totalitarian system. So these 6 characteristics of totalitarianism, and China gets 10 points for B, C, and D, and at least 9 points for A, E, and F. The CCP has 100% monopoly on military, judiciary, Congress, and the traditional media, and 90% monopoly on internet, economic organizations, or social organizations. So China today is at least 95% totalitarianism. When talking about political change or social movement, the difference between totalitarianism and authoritarianism matters a lot. What's more, the Communist Party has established what I call a high-tech totalitarianism. It utilizes artificial intelligence, great firewall, big data, facial recognition, DNA, and modern telecommunications to keep people under total surveillance. The internet has been used as an effective tool for censorship, propaganda, and brainwashing. Under the high-tech version of 1984, any collective resistance from information, communication to organization or mobilization becomes extremely difficult. What's worse is, the Tiananmen massacre made the Chinese people live in what I call a post-Tang syndrome. Anger and fear turned into silence, and silence into indifference, and indifference into cynicism. So the most horrible autocracy is not the one suppressing resistance, but the one making you feel unnecessary to resist, or even make you defend the regime. Think about the cynicism, social Darwinism, and radical nationalism. We should not take it for granted that a regime change or a coup in China could lead to a constitutional democracy. There are some important elements impacting Chinese political change: economic crisis, bordering areas, the political struggles within the party, and geopolitical changes. But one thing many people have ignored is the Communist Party's Black Death. Since 1949, the party has committed extremely cruel anti-humanitarian crimes. Like here's a list from the killing of landowners, Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen Massacre, to the ongoing Uyghur genocide. In my opinion, this is a huge barrier to democratic change. The longer the party state remains, the more crimes it will commit, the more people will suffer, and the more difficult for the party to believe that they'll be forgiven by the people. Xi Jinping and the party have explicitly excluded the choice of democratization. It's worth recalling that what Deng Xiaoping famously said after Tiananmen massacre, that the regime would be willing to kill 200,000 people in exchange for 20 years of stability. Here we have to distinguish the CCP's interest from China's national interest. In most occasions, the two are in conflict. Given the nature of one-party system operation, Li Keqiang or any other potential top reformers is not innocent. Those who refuse this reform can easily accuse the reformers of corruption or human rights violations. I was frequently asked a question, and it's the title of this event, what should the outsiders do to promote democracy in China? I have a list of suggestions, but last month when I, together with a few human rights defenders, met Secretary of State Blinken, he asked what other things the United States should not do. So here are some suggestions. We should, the first and the foremost thing is to stop doing what are politically and morally wrong, and what have been proven counterproductive, what have been facilitating the dictatorship, what have been endangering human rights and freedom. Like stop providing technologies and equipment to Chinese censorship and surveillance. Stop cooperating with Chinese intelligence in arresting dissidents, and stop praising Chinese dictators or treating them as democratically elected leaders. Stop voting China to be a member of UN Human Rights Council or to host the Olympics. Stop Confucius Institute and many other organizations under the United Front work. Stop sacrificing human rights by prioritizing other issues like trade, nuclear, or climate change. And I have different opinions from Rogers about how likely a coup can happen in China. But I totally agree with him that the US and its allies should re-examine the engagement policy and support the Chinese people who are promoting a free China. In other words, no matter how difficult a regime change is in China, no matter how regime change policies used to be not working in other countries, the West should not exclude it from its China policy. That's the key to defend the liberal international order. When the international community sacrifices its own values for the sake of regional and international stability or economic growth, it only tells the CCP that it does not need to reform. So unprincipled engagement with the autocratic regime is an alias for appeasement. Since 1989, or even earlier, the West has indulged and facilitated the rising of a dictatorial regime. China has become a direct and urgent threat to global human rights and democracy. It is the obligation and task of the Chinese people to overthrow the CCP, but it's also the interest and the responsibility of the West. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tong Dao. And now let me hand the session over to Elizabeth Economy, who for many years directed the Asia program at the Council on Foreign Relations, and now is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Liz?
Great, thank you, Orville. And I hope to bring you back into the conversation as well. So Roger and Biao, really two fascinating sets of remarks and very provocative. And Roger, congratulations on a terrific new book that's, I would say, both very informative and also just a fun read, which is not something that is all that easy to achieve. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to get us started on the discussion. And Roger, let me start with you. Let me ask you to address some of the points that Biao raised, namely that in fact, Xi Jinping, there's not going to be much difference between Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, Wang Qishan, that in fact, the arrival of Xi Jinping on the China stage was a gift to the party. It was a necessity for the party to save itself, and that is in the interest of all the rest of the Chinese leadership as well. And that a large degree of cynicism has in fact set in among the Chinese people. They may not be interested in seeing a massive regime change. And to that, let me add an article that was just published by two of your British compatriots, Rana Mitter and Elspeth Johnson, just published in the Harvard Business Review, in which they argue that, in fact, the Chinese regime is legitimate and we need to recognize it as such, that, in fact, this Leninist system is recognized by the Chinese people as having produced a very competent set of Chinese leaders. And by the way, look at how China managed through the COVID-19 crisis, much more effectively, certainly in the early stages than any other large economy or major democracy. So how do you address this particular set of issues that, in fact, we should really just recognize this regime as legitimate and that, in fact, there's not that much dissension within the top leadership or indeed throughout much of the population. And what you're talking about is going to be a very narrow swath of sort of Chinese intellectual elites and a few others.
I'm flabbergasted that anybody should be proposing in this day and age that we recognize the Chinese regime as legitimate. I mean, it is for the Chinese people to recognize its legitimacy or otherwise. Let them have a free vote on it. I mean, that we should sit here in our comfortable sitting rooms in the West and declare on behalf of the Chinese people that the regime which has ruled them with dictatorship for 70 years is legitimate takes my breath away. I'll say no more on that subject. Let me address the tougher questions tougher issues raised by Deng Biao on whether there are members of the elite in the Communist Party today who secretly are deeply dissatisfied with the direction in which Xi Jinping is leading the party in China, and whether they would like to remove him from office and take China on a radically different course. First of all, of course, and Deng Biao knows this better than I do, in a totalitarian regime, you don't signal your intentions, or it's very difficult even to hint at your true beliefs. But if we look back over the careers of Li Keqiang, Wang Qishan, and Wang Yang and their personalities, there is evidence which led me to believe that they are deeply dissatisfied with the effect of the strategy pursued by Xi Jinping. I hope I have outlined some of those reasons in my talk, but let me just add one thing, which during the tsunami of outrage and anger provoked by the treatment of Dr. Li Wenliang, the doctor in Wuhan, who signaled to alerted China and the world to COVID-19 and was then suppressed. In the aftermath of that tsunami, some people went online in the Chinese internet inside China and called for 3 members of the senior Chinese leadership to organize or to demand a calling of I think it was the full Politburo, in order to discuss whether Xi Jinping was the right person to continue to lead China. And who were the 3 people named in that internet? Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, and Wang Qishan. So it wasn't just Roger Garside sitting here in South London who had identified these 3 people as the likely leaders of a plot. There were people deep inside China who are doing the same. I'll finish there.
Okay, great, thank you. So let me quickly turn to Teng Biao, because I know that we're already running up against the time for everyone else to join in, and I can see there are already a lot of questions. But Biao, let me just ask you, you've lived through, as Orville said, basically the sweep of contemporary Chinese history and have experienced those times of greater opening and greater repression. You've sort of indicated that you don't believe that Roger's scenario of a coup is the most likely. What in your mind will it take, or would it take, for a period of greater opening to return to China and stick, and for there to be genuine political democratic reform?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I really don't think a coup is likely. The top leaders really are afraid of the retaliation from the people, and they don't believe that the Chinese people will forgive their so-called blood debt. I don't know how the Chinese people can achieve liberal democracy. I believe China will enjoy a constitutional, the Western-style democracy, but it takes maybe a long time, and it's and there are a lot of political uncertainties. So and since the space for resistance in China is very much limited, I really hope the international community, especially United States and the major democracies, can think about pushing China's democratization. So in this way, I agree with Roger that the West has a responsibility and really has a capacity to push forward Chinese democracy.
Okay, I know that my time is up. Orville, I don't know, I can't let you in, but maybe Glenn will be gracious and give you a shot at some point in the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, Roger and Biao. I want to open up the question and answer section, segment of our event with a question from Larry Diamond, and then, as Liz promised, Orville Schell.
Well, Roger, you said that, and thank you both for your extraordinarily moving and challenging remarks. Roger, you said that it shouldn't be just soft power that we use to challenge the Chinese regime, but what can we do with soft power to try and engage young Chinese people and others who would like change but lack access to information? And how can we counter this new ideological campaign by Xi Jinping and the senior Chinese Communist Party leadership that's seeking to isolate them from information flows, indoctrinate them, and whip up a new generation of patriotism, quote unquote?
Well, I think we're already doing quite a lot of what needs to be done. I mean, to enroll 300,000 Chinese students in US universities, and think of that, we've probably got about 150,000 in the UK. I mean, huge quantities. Taking young people at the most formative years of their education and exposing them to our societies is a very powerful means. I think that we've got to redouble efforts to pierce the Great Firewall. I think that VOA does a great job, but I'm absolutely dismayed at the way that the BBC Chinese language service has been allowed to, I don't know if it even exists anymore, but that is a national scandal. I think we all have to put more resources, and this is certainly true in the UK. We need desperately to raise the quality of our Chinese studies. When we started fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union, there was a massive investment in Soviet studies. The same needs to be done today. Those are some of my thoughts, but maybe Deng Biao has others.
Yeah, so I have a list of what we should do and what we should not do, and I totally agree with that with Roger that the Great Firewall is extremely important. So I really hope our American president can give a speech, tear down the Great Firewall. And Magnitsky Act is very powerful. That's one of the few tools that the Western countries can use to sanction the human rights violators and the corrupt officials.
Thank you. Orville, please.
Well, let me just make some very brief comments. The first thing is, I would have to say, having watched the Chinese drama unfold for as many decades as I have, we've never predicted anything accurately. So that's because China is such an unresolved society that they're equal and opposite forces always pulling in different directions. The second thing that I would note is, I think for me, the thing that makes me a little skeptical about Roger's scenario, not that I disagree with his analysis of the fracture lines in society, is that China's sort of techno-autocracy now, the means of control are radically different than anything we have ever seen in human history. And we simply don't know how all of that is going to play out. So finally, I would say, I think if there's going to be a change in China, it must come from within China. And if I had to say, how will it come? It will probably have something to do with the economy. And all economies are cyclical. And when China hits a bad cycle, that is when it will be tested, as we were tested in 2008, as we were tested just recently. And we'll see how that goes.
Orville says we never predicted anything correctly. I want to tell him about one prediction I made, which did come true. The morning I was in Beijing, the day that Deng Xiaoping was stripped of all his offices after the Qingming demonstrations of April '76, when I was on the square every day. My ambassador called me into his office and he said, "Roger, you've heard the news, Deng Xiaoping's been stripped of all his offices. What's going to happen now?" I said, "Ambassador, Deng Xiaoping is going to get back and he's going to rule this country." My ambassador pushed himself back from his desk in his chair, gave a mocking laugh and said, "Roger, that's not going to happen. But I tell you what, if it does happen, I'll have you promoted." Sadly, by the time Deng Xiaoping got back, Teddy You'd had moved on back to London. But to take the point about, I want to take another point about prediction. Who in January 1991 was predicting that the Soviet Union was going to collapse and that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would dissolve itself? No one amongst the huge Sovietology industry in the free world was saying that. But within 10 months, both those things had happened. And of course, once great changes have happened, everybody can say they thought it was inevitable. But the techno dictatorship, techno-totalitarianism. Yes, I agree. This is a very important and challenging issue for readers of my book. But when scientists develop techniques for offensive espionage, they also develop defensive techniques against those measures. And I believe that the Chinese leadership is not negligent in that regard. And for every measure that they develop, they will be developing countermeasures, and my plotters will have access to those countermeasures.
Very well. Biao, would you like to add anything to Roger's remarks before we take more questions?
Very briefly. So I think that kind of coup is not likely, but I think it's very important for the West to think about that possibility, to like prioritize human rights and democracy in China. So that would be, it will be very different to have that kind of scenario or totally excluded. Yeah, so if you prioritize the trade, the economic relations, not human rights or China's democracy, that's not helpful, and that will take a longer time for China to achieve democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to invite members of the audience to submit more questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of their screens. But in the meantime, I want to draw on some threads that have been raised here in the conversation and also in the questions, and maybe pull them together in a question that I'll start by posing to Roger. I'm thinking here of the Soviet Union and today's Russia. You know, the record of coups against non-democratic leaders is mixed at best. There were 2 abortive coups, one against Gorbachev, one against Yeltsin, and now we have Putin. And Russia is no less of a challenge to the United States and to Europe than it certainly was 30, 40 years ago, though the military challenge is significantly reduced. Very often, coups produce political disorder and violence, followed by consolidation under a different kind of dictator. Xi has painted himself into a corner. Should we be careful what we wish for? What risk of a populist regime that sustains itself even more than today through demagogic appeals to nationalism and Han chauvinism in the manner of a Milosevic or a Putin do we risk encountering? And I have in mind, of course, Milosevic in Kosovo, Putin in Crimea, and what does this mean for Taiwan?
Well, it's always possible to paint gloomy scenarios. And I don't, for a moment, discount the kind of outcomes which you've conjured up. And I was careful in designing my book to end it at the point where my successful plotters launch a transition to democracy, to have assessed how that transition will actually go would have been the work of another book. And it would have required powers of foresight that not even I possess. So that is, but there are reasons, and I give some in my last chapter. I give Li Keqiang the opportunity in his first speech to the Central Committee to answer your question. So I would refer you for a full answer to your question to my last chapter. But there are, let me just sketch 1 or 2 things. Look at the structure of Chinese society today. You have a great middle class which has grown up, a property-owning class which has grown up, which is educated, which has traveled, which is networked, which, as Deng Biao said, knows much more about human rights than anybody in the Soviet Union did. Millions have had tertiary education at some of the finest universities in the world. I think those are all factors. That's factors which in history have property-owning classes have moved to a form of society, to the rule of law, to protect the property they have achieved. So I think that they have a strong incentive for that. But beyond that, I must refer you to my book.
Thank you. I want to give Biao the last word very briefly, and then we'll conclude our session.
Thank you very much. The Chinese Communist Party always resorts to nationalism and like Han chauvinism when facing that crisis, and they did this, and they are doing this. And regarding the ongoing Uyghur genocide, and very disappointingly, many Chinese like dissidents and pro-democracy intellectuals also embrace the Han chauvinism and kind of racism, nationalism. So so it's really hard to be optimistic when thinking about what's happening in Tibet and Xinjiang, and that might be a great barrier and and a lot of uncertainty when China is going from dictatorship to democracy. So I really hope I really hope that the Chinese dissidents, human rights defenders, and intellectuals to give up their narrow-minded racism and Han chauvinism.
Thank you very much, Roger, Biao, Liz, and Orville, for an outstanding discussion, a lot of food for thought in it. I'd like to thank our audience as well, and particularly those who posed questions. We didn't get to them all, but I tried to draw some threads out of them. This concludes our event. I invite you to read Roger's new book, China Coup, and acquaint yourself with Tong Biao's inspiring lifetime of work as a lawyer and activist to build a better China. Thank you so much. Be well.